Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Cafecito. My name is Ángel Antonio Ruiz Lavoy. I'm the Director of Arts and Culture at CENTRO. For decades, Chicago have championed national conversations on Puerto Rican self-determination and Latina issues, such as immigration and bilingual education. It is with no doubt one of the more solid and organized Puerto Rican diaspora communities in the U.S. Their sense of community, their first celebration of their Puerto Ricanness, and their political awareness, it's outstanding and unique. The exhibition Entre Horizontes, Art and Activism between Chicago and Puerto Rico examines the artistic genealogies and social justice movements that connects Puerto Rico and Chicago. It opened on August 19, 2023, and it's on view at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago through May 5th, 2024. Carla Acevedo Yates, it's the curator, and Iris Colburn is the curatorial assistant for this exhibition. We're thrilled to have Carla as a guest for today's Cafecito series. Carla is going to be in dialogue with our directora, Dr. Yomaira Figueroa-Vásquez. And for those of you who do not know Carla, Carla Acevedo Yates was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, is the Marilyn and Larry Fields Curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art of Chicago. And she has worked as a curator, researcher, and art critic across Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States. She earned a master's degree in curatorial studies and contemporary art from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College, where she was awarded the Ramapo Curatorial Prize. Welcome, Carla. Welcome, Yomaira, and welcome, everyone. And we hope that you enjoy the conversation.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Cafecito con Carla Acevedo Yates. I'm Yomaira Figueroa. Thank you so much, Ángel Antonio, for the introduction to both the conversation and to Carla, who I am honored to call a friend and a colleague. So Carla, in the hopes of having a very organic conversation with you, we talked just like a little bit about what we wanted to say about this amazing exhibit that you curated, and also about the trajectory of your work. I wanted to offer the fact that Carla and I, as two Boricuas, met in the Midwest. We actually met at Michigan State University when Carla was at the Broad Museum in East Lansing, Michigan, and I was an assistant professor of diaspora studies in the English department. And it was then that we started to have conversations and collaborate. It was really exciting to meet another Boricua in that campus.
Yeah.
And then Carla got this amazing position at the MCA in Chicago, and then she left me in the cold. Pero I want to talk a little bit about this exhibition, which I had the honor of seeing at the opening in August, and also was able to see some of the parts kind of reflected in some of the own work that I'm doing, particularly the Frank Espada stuff. But it was such an incredible exhibition, and I wanted to talk to you about like how it came to be, this idea of art and activism between Chicago and Puerto Rico, really thinking about how it is so embedded in community, right? On community histories and practices. So there's so many things to say about this exhibition, but I would love to hear from you. How did it come to be? How did you come to imagine an exhibition such as this, and why in Chicago? Why the MCA?
Yeah, first off, I'm so honored to be in conversation with you, Yomaira, because I admire your work so much. And I'm so happy you're at Centro, again, coming all the way from Michigan. And now both of us in different positions. It's really a great way to continue this relationship that we started back in 2016. So the exhibition really came together when I started working here. I moved here in 2019 to take this position at the MCA Chicago. And at that time, the chief curator was Michael Darling. And there was an open call for exhibitions by the Terra Foundation for American Art for their Art Design Chicago project, whose theme was looking at historic migrations to and from Chicago. So starting off with that open call, immediately I thought of what if we looked at the Puerto Rican migration to Chicago, but also all these artists that I already knew that had come to Chicago to pursue masters in fine art. So even before coming here to take on this position, I knew of so many artists and friends that had done, a lot of them, most of them, their fine arts degrees at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So I had a good sense of that connection. And I had heard of the Puerto Rican community here, of course, and their important activism, but I had really no idea how important and how the cohesiveness of the community and how they have really staked a claim within a part of the city. And it's something that is very unique all over the world. I don't think there's any place in the world like Paseo Boricua in the Humboldt Park area. And I wanted to tell that story. And usually, you know, I'm a curator. I work with visual artists, but I really wanted to tell the story of Puerto Rican migration to Chicago because there were a lot of questions around that. And there's a lot of, you know, misunderstandings around how Puerto Ricans actually arrived here. And also because I did, you know, pursue my undergrad and graduate studies in New York. And when we think of Puerto Rican diasporas, we might think of New York and Florida, but not necessarily the Midwest. And Chicago is part of those historic migrations that happened in the 1940s and 50s. So we started doing, you know, a lot of research around that and wanting to include those parallel histories. So both the artistic, meaning all these artists that have come and through Chicago that also were raised here perhaps, or that have been here for decades. So to include that artistic history, but together with a social justice history that has been important throughout the decades. And so the show, this idea of the Entre Horizontes, or between horizons, is a metaphor for thinking about migration, for thinking about displacement, but it's very rooted in Chicago because when I arrived in 2019, it was summer months, it was July, and I do live near the lake, and it really does have this very Caribbean feel to it, although I have to admit, it's super cold. I mean, nothing of the sort, like in Puerto Rico. But every time I spoke with artists and community members, I heard once and again the horizon, the lake, and how important that body of water is for Chicago life and Chicago history. So the idea around Entre Horizontes came together of like joining these two horizons as a metaphor for displacement, of having this beautiful horizon over the water here in Chicago and thinking about the horizon over the water in Puerto Rico as a metaphor for displacement and identity.
That's really incredible. And actually, you answered so many of my questions about the question of the horizon, right? The question of the kind of community impact in the way that you shape the exhibition itself. And I also, you know, having been on the other side of the lake in Chicago, right, that Lake Michigan that connects, you know, Michigan and Illinois, it's really incredible because you can imagine that there's no more beautiful waters than the waters of Puerto Rico. And then you look at Lake Michigan, especially in the northern parts, and how beautiful and crystalline blue and turquoise it is. And for a second, you're like, oh, wow, this is beautiful. But then you put your feet in and it's actually ice cold. So then that's when you get the the reality check. But yeah, but I think the kind of landscape becomes such an important part of the migration story, right? Of Puerto Ricans to Chicago, as well as all the reasons, you know, that folks are migrating for different forms of labor, right? In terms of the kind of community itself within the exhibition, I think it was really, for me, really powerful to see how the show had incredible, you know, a series of different artists there. But then there was also kind of archival documents and templates and ephemera and photographs. And one of the things that I noticed, and one of the things that I heard, especially in the weeks, you know, after the opening of the exhibition, where the community members were coming to see it, and in the vitrinas that were, right, like in the kind of glass cases, people were seeing their grandparents, their parents, their community members in a place like the Museum of Contemporary Art, in an exhibition about Puerto Rico. And I thought that that was, you know, some of the most incredible moments, right, of people being able to recognize themselves and their history in this space, in this museum space.
I mean, honestly, it's a Puerto Rican occupation of the MCA Chicago. That's how I see it, because also for folks who haven't seen the show, there's a huge mural right before you come into the exhibition that says Museo in Spanish That mural is by an artist, Rafael Ferrer, and was recreated from a 1972 exhibition that he had at the MCA Chicago in our older building. So there was also a resurfacing of Puerto Rican Chicago MCA history within the show. So I see it kind of like this Puerto Rican occupation, like a museum within a museum, which I thought, what an interesting concept to have. But what you're talking about in terms of the archival material, for me was really important, again, to tell the story of migration here that is largely unknown. And of course, a lot of folks know and some don't. But Puerto Ricans first arrived in Chicago in the 1940s, recruited by a temp agency, Castle Barton and Associates, to work in foundries and the steel mills, and then also brought women as domestic workers. So there's a whole really interesting history and a formation of community that really was displaced here in Chicago. They established communities, tight-knit communities in different parts of Chicago. And as the city became gentrified, they were being pushed around, and they faced many forms of discrimination, including housing discrimination, police brutality, a lot of problems with education. And the community has actualized itself and organized itself to create their own organizations to meet their own needs. I mean, we have the National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture, the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, which is one of the oldest Puerto Rican organizations in the city. We have the Puerto Rican Agenda. So they have all organized to really create a community that is really unique. If you walk down the streets of Division Street around Paseo Boricua, I mean, it really does feel like a community, like a village. So again, telling those stories was important, but for me, I didn't want to just because I'm a new arrival, so to speak, to Chicago. I've been here at that point a year when I really started getting into this research, and I have to give credit to Iris Colburn, curatorial associate on the show, who did a lot of research for this exhibition, was really gathering all these materials. So there's a lot of archival material, photographs, newspaper clippings from public archives, but also personal archives. So really reached out to community members and gathered their materials to display in the cases. And also gathered their stories, and we really wanted to tell their stories from their point of view. So also the tables have audio of interviews that we conducted with several community members. So it was a very interesting curatorial process that for me was a first of how do you really do community engagement, or how do you engage a community within the process of actually doing an exhibition and not after an exhibition opens. So you came to the opening and it was a huge celebration, and people felt like it was their exhibition because they knew what they were going to see. It was their materials, their family members, their voices. So it was a really special moment. And it was an exhibition that is trying to gather all of those stories from the people who lived them, and it's not this authoritative voice, but really people were involved, community members were involved in the making of this part of the exhibition.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, the opening of the exhibition was a celebration. It was really beautiful to witness this. And we talk a lot about ethics when it comes to curation, community when it comes to curation. We talk about the kind of problematizing the space and the kind of institutionalizations of museums. And this exhibition for me seemed like it was that kind of ethical practice in action, right? To really a really well thought out, really deeply rooted in its community. And you can also see both in the exhibition itself and in Paseo Boricua, a kind of relationality with Boricuas and other communities, which I thought was pretty incredible, right? So, going to the exhibition, you can see this kind of this rich Puerto Rican history of Chicago, as well as artists who are creating work in Chicago, as well as artists that have multiple identities. And then when you go to Paseo Boricua, you also see the same thing. I was particularly struck in Paseo Boricua by seeing how incredible it is to have this kind of few blocks, right, that are mostly Puerto Rican owned, with all of these businesses, lots of self-determination. You could see that in that history there. And then there's that grocery store that's like a Palestinian Puerto Rican, grocery store, right? And all of these like beautiful forms of solidarity in action. Can you talk to me a little bit about the exhibition and how you saw like Puerto Rican and Boricua history, connected to other histories of Chicago and other groups of people? How did that come up, and how did you kind of see a way to kind of form that as part of the exhibition?
Yeah, so that was the main point of like Chicago, Puerto Rico, or Puerto Rican Chicago is part of Chicago history. And if you see the progression of the archival material, first it's talking about the migration of Puerto Ricans, and that initial connection and how political it was, because that migration had to do with the Chicago experiment as part of Operation Bootstrap. So it's giving a larger context of really like a type of forced migration that we still face on the island. But also thinking about all of the rebellions, right? And that connects us with the African American community. So all this idea around, or language around riots, it's trying to reframe that language, that it was a rebellion. It was a community rebellion against poor treatment of the Puerto Rican community. And then it goes to the issue and organization around the liberation of the political prisoners, right? And there is a section also about thinking about transcultural solidarities, because something that I learned from Jan Sussler, and this is where I'm kind of addressing your question about bringing these histories together, is that, and Jan Sussler, for those who don't know, is the attorney who led the case with also the Boricua Human Rights Network to the Supreme Court to liberate the political prisoners. And that law office is based here in Chicago, the People's Law Office. And through this exhibition, I've become really great friends with Jan, and we have built a really beautiful relationship. What I've learned from her is that there was absolutely no way that they could have achieved the liberation of the political prisoners without transcultural solidarities, without the concept of solidarities across different political ideologies, but also across different Latino communities here in Chicago. And there's always been a really beautiful and solidary relationship between the Puerto Rican community, the Mexican community, the Palestinian community has been very present, for example, in the Puerto Rican Day Parade. So there is that side of that I wanted to show in the exhibition, and there's some materials around that to give a sense of how together we can achieve more, right? And I think that the idea of politicizing those relationships and working together to address issues that affect all communities that are marginalized in the city is very, very important.
Yeah, and I think that the exhibition really kind of destaca or really highlights how those relationships come to form, and how they're kind of mutually constitutive out of histories of struggle, right, and solidarity. And I think that we're in this moment in the world of art and museums and exhibitions where we have a chance to imagine things differently, right? For these institutions that have these long, both storied and complex histories, oftentimes mired in violence. I'm standing here at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Puerto Rico, looking at the Puerto Rico Negro exhibition, right? And it's really interesting to be in this place, and you at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, right? Like what that means. And I'm thinking about the journey for curators. Can you talk to us a little bit about your journey to becoming a curator, right? There are not that many Puerto Rican curators in the United States working right now in the kind of position that you have. How did it come to be? How did you get this? What was the kind of dream or the vision that you had, and also the kind of journey to get you to this place to be able to create an exhibition such as Entre Horizontes?
Well, it was kind of like not very intentional, to be honest. Like it was like, oh, I want to be a curator. I don't think I had an awareness of that, what that was when I was growing up. Like other fields, I want to be like a doctor or whatever, or even a art historian. And I do come from a literature background. I did art history as an undergrad, but my major is literature and poetry. So I do come from the literary world. And I did live in Europe several years before coming back to Puerto Rico, and most of my friends were artists, and I did want to write. I mean, that my background is in writing. And I met an artist, a Trinidadian artist, Christopher Cozier, who's still a mentor of mine. And it was the context of the Trienal Poligráfica. And he asked me, why don't you write about Puerto Rican artists? There's like a lack of writing and critical writing around Puerto Rican art history. And you would be, why don't you try and write about Catherine Matos Olivo, for example, who was a friend of mine, and unfortunately she passed away very young. And I started writing for Small Axe, and Kathy and I were very good friends, and I published an article about her work, and then I started publishing other articles, and then I started writing about art, and then I started making exhibitions on my own in Puerto Rico. Like, as you know, there's a few institutions, there's not a lot of opportunities in terms of if you want to be a curator. And it was kind of happened in that way. And until I was like, I really want to work in a museum, and I want to pursue a curatorial studies degree. So I moved to upstate New York to pursue my graduate studies in curatorial studies. I think that's where things started to shape for me, because I started doing the work on the ground. And then I was like, this is what I want to do. This is what makes sense for me. I wanna work with these artists. Like, I want to tell these stories. Like, I'm interested in this art history. And it kind of evolved from there. My first institutional job was at the Broad Art Museum, where we met. And I was there 3 years, and I think I did like almost 20 it was a very frenetic time, as you know. I did a lot of exhibitions. And then until here in 2019, and here in Chicago, I think I found the perfect context to really develop a curatorial project that it transcends a single exhibition. And that's how I see my work. It's like one big curatorial project where each exhibition is contributing an idea or developing an idea over time. And something that I've been working on for the past 3 or 4 years is the concept of diaspora, and because of a personal experience. And I think that is a relevant thing to discuss today because of all these geopolitical movements and migrations that we see on the streets. So it's important to think about how identities are formed in displacement. But also, thinking about how this work looks like, in the setting of the MCA at an institution that has not really addressed these histories, and really making a point and being intentional about it. And also bringing Spanish language into this institution. And that's a big part of that curatorial project, which is institutional transformation. So I don't think it's about only like doing exhibitions. It's like how each project can transform an institution at the end. And of course, I have amazing colleagues here at the MCA who are incredibly supportive. But I think that's what we want, right? We want to transform these institutions and not just do one show here, one show there, but it takes time, and it takes several projects where you're developing ideas over time and thinking about, in particular, how, culture is not produced in isolation. Of course, we all know that. It's like a collision of sorts, and it's messy, And I really try to think about that through my work.
No, absolutely. And I think that it's really visible. And I've been thinking about your vision as a curator, not just being show by show, right? Like bregando with this show, bregando with the next show, but actually having a larger umbrella, or there's like a larger arc. It's actually really key for me to understand how you're functioning, because one of the things that I am thinking about is the show before Entre Horizontes, the Forecast Forms, right? Forecast Form, Art in the Caribbean Diaspora, 1990s to today, was an incredible exhibition that you also curated. It was at the MCA. And I just want to add a personal note, as someone who, loves and dabbles in visual art and culture. I was able to bring my mother there, someone who does not dabble in the art, in the world of visual art and culture. And it was her first time in a museum, and her first time in a contemporary art museum. And it was, I think, a really transformative experience for her, someone who grew up in Caguas, in the Barriada, in the Monte Tomás de Castro, coming to this museum in Chicago and having this experience of being able to not only be in the place of Chicago where a lot of my uncles migrated, but none of the women in my family migrated. So being in the place of, oh, this is where my brothers came to this place, Chicago, and then also seeing all of this Caribbean art and she stopped at every single piece in the exhibition and was like, what is this? She's going to read about it, right? And the fact that it was in English and Spanish, right? The fact that there was like multiple language, the fact, just so accessible, so incredible. And I think one of the things that she stepped away from that exhibition, and I would love for you to talk about it, one of the things she said that stayed with me, she said, these artists are so brave. They're so brave for doing this work and for saying these things, right? And for me, it was really incredible to stand there and witness her, una señora ya, being like, wow, this is really incredible to see this, shown back to her, this lived experience and experiences that she had not lived, right? So I just wanted to tell you how incredible that is. And as part of the larger vision and the kind of intention meditation that you have on diaspora, how impactful it is. Can you tell us a little bit about Forecast Forms?
Yeah, it's such a complex exhibition. I always have like a lot of trouble kind of talking about it in a very concise way. But it's an exhibition that is traveling right now. It's opening in San Diego. It was in Boston at the ICA, and we're installing very soon at the MCA San Diego. And it's gathering 37 artists in its original iteration here in Chicago that are really thinking about the connections between identity, place, and representation. So part of the larger question was where is the Caribbean, what it is, and how does it look like? And I think that we have all of these preconceived notions or imaginaries that are produced around the Caribbean, right? Like the palm trees, which I see in your background, which they are there, of course. But this like lush, tropical kind of touristy place to take a break, to take a vacation, a place of leisure, of rest, that really obscures like the labor and the histories of colonialism and the legacies of colonialism that are still very much a part of daily life. So through that exhibition, I really wanted to work with artists that through forms and materials are looking at those histories. So not really thinking about exclusively about representing these histories in a narrative way, but it was a show that is very materially driven and very process driven. So thinking that the formal aspects of a work and that for an art historian is like the process, the materials, and the techniques that an artist uses to think about the world that surrounds them, to think about the histories that have conformed their environment, are not mutually exclusive from those histories. So the materials themselves carry history. Process itself is a way of communicating these historical processes. It was a kind of like taking people through an experience of understanding and dismantling the Caribbean trope, the tropical trope, and then rebuilding it through a very materially driven, process-based exhibition.
Absolutely. And I think it is such a beautiful foreshadowing then to the Entre Horizontes exhibition, right? Like it seems seamless, although I know that there are like different things and different material conditions, right, that led to the creation of each. But there's something very inspiring about this vision that you have for this kind of curatorial work in the world, and and the kind of deep commitment that it has to storytelling from the perspective of the people themselves who are living these histories, right? And so in that way, I think that the locus of enunciation of your curatorial vision is one that is really exciting to be able to like discuss with you, but also one that I think should be taken under serious consideration from folks who are studying what it means to do this work in the world. We have a question in the chat about the Entre Horizontes exhibition. And Jasmine Rivera wanted to know if this show is going to travel, like the Forecast Forum show, and will it be shown in different cities? In that case, this or kind of an iteration of the show?
Unfortunately, this show is not traveling. it takes a lot of institutional resources to travel a show, and this one unfortunately will not travel, but it does have a publication that will be coming out in the summer that we are working on right now that I'm very, very excited, and we'll gather the spirit of the show, which is the art historical and the historical. So there'll be a good, representation of the show and installation images, which usually catalogs don't have that because we do them, for the opening of the show. So what is great about this publication is that we'll gather images from the actual exhibition, but no, it's not traveling.
No, that's great to know. And I think it's really important, to kind of think about how incredible it is to have works travel, but then how actually equally impactful it is to have a show be institute, like in its place of something about Puerto Rico and Chicago, to be like, this exists here for this moment in time. And then everyone else, you can have a version of this through that catalog, but in reality, like the place of the show is here, and it opens and it sunsets here, right, in this horizon, in this place. So I think that despite the kind of institutional funding and all of the resources that it takes to move shows, that there's actually something really compelling and poetic about that show being in Chicago for its people there, right? And for those
it's for Chicago. I mean, I don't want to say it's not for Chicago, but it's a show that it's like a love letter to Puerto Rican Chicago, I would say.
Yeah.
The city that has welcomed me and that I feel so proud to be a part of. And honestly, the Puerto Rican community has embraced me. Now I'm part of like the arts committee of the Puerto Rican agenda. Like I'm knee deep in this community, and it's such an amazing community that it's for them, but also for our audiences that perhaps haven't been to Paseo Boricua, that don't know this history, that don't know like the amazing Puerto Rican artists that have passed through Chicago or that live here. There's so many good Puerto Rican artists here.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think the Puerto Rican community in Chicago is one with this very rich history, one with a very like radical political history. And it's also one that will like snatch you up if you step foot in Chicago as a Puerto Rican. They're like, come on, ven acá. You're gonna have avena here. We're gonna do this there.
Literally.
We're gonna, right? Like,
we're gonna feed you. It's like so Puerto Rican. All the meetings and all the openings, it's like, we're gonna feed you. There's to drink, there's food. Now let's get down to business, But like, it's such a nurturing community. And I just feel so honored that they have embraced me and my work, and that they always like saying like how proud they are to have a Puerto Rican at the MCA. And I'm like, I'm the one who feels so proud to have this show here, to have it live in the galleries for so long, because it opened in August and it's had quite a run. And I even like, when I'm kind of like, I go to the show all the time. Like I went today just to take a look, how people are responding to the work and so on. And it's a huge honor. I feel really, really honored to present this exhibition here.
And I think like in the world of contemporary art museums, particularly in the North, like in the Northern hemisphere of the world, it's really special to be able to have a space like the MCA with you there, to have it kind of like Caribbeanized, even down to the like shop, right? There's like, you can tell that there's like, I'm like, oh no, Carla was here, or she sent somebody here to choose what could be sold here in response to the exhibition, right? And so there's something really beautiful about the curation, even in those kinds of areas, right? Where you could say like, oh, this is a very, Caribbean jewelry, Caribbean, right? Like, and so for me, you could see that it's not just that they're giving you a room to be like, okay, do your little Puerto Rican thing in the room, but that actually it has enveloped the spirit of the place, right? And I think that that's something that we want to see so much more of in places in Chicago and beyond Chicago, right? Like, what is the possibilities, right, beyond this place?
But also, I was like, when Forecast Forum was proposed, I'm like, I want the biggest gallery. I want to take up space here. I don't want a little show. And it happened. And I have to say, my director, Madeline Grinstein, so many people here that have supported this work and have believed in my projects. I can't say that enough. But for me, like Forecast Forum was really transformative, not only because it really launched the bilingual initiative. Now since Forecast formed, the MCA Chicago is a fully bilingual English-Spanish institution, and that is a huge accomplishment. So all the sort of Caribbean kind of things that you see, it's because there's also like there's continuity. And I am working on another show that will be Caribbean centered as well. I can't speak a lot about it, but like it's not just one show here and there. This is a commitment to this work, to the region and to rethinking the region, because part of Forecast Forum was like, the Caribbean is not just the islands. The Caribbean is constituted by migrations and from places that people don't even imagine, as you know. So it was really thinking about how the Caribbean is constituted by all of these different movements, and including artists with connections and Caribbean heritage, to include those diasporas in the conversation. And that's something that has been kind of like a thread through the Entre Horizontes and some projects that I'm thinking in the future.
I'm really excited about that. You know, I was going to ask you about the future projects, but I know that these things are like so mired in bureaucracy and like red tape and you can't say anything. So I didn't want to be like, what's next? But we know that something amazing is coming next. I can feel it. And I mean, in thinking about the kind of Caribbean diaspora, it reminds me so much of the kind of movement towards this kind of archipelagic thinking, right? Like the Caribbean archipelago, but also New York, Chicago, Miami, other places as an extension of that archipelago. And in fact, one of the really interesting things for me when I first moved to Michigan was someone had come back from Mackinac Island, this little island, you know, in northern Michigan. And they said, you know, I went to Mackinac Island, and did you know that everyone who works there is Jamaican? Like they have this migration of like people who work there who come from Jamaica. And I said, well, this is like another example, right, of like Caribbean labor being ferried across, right, telegraphed over to the global north for seasons, like a seasonal thing, right? So to think about that long history, that the trajectory of like labor movement and forced and voluntary movement, but that it's a continuing and overlapping till today. And to be able to capture so much of that becomes such an important part of our collective story in the Caribbean, and also to be able to situate Puerto Rico within the history of the Caribbean and not exceptional to it, right? Because in so many ways, Puerto Rico sometimes falls out of the conversation of the like Antilles, right? So there's something really powerful about that constant conversation. I wanted, you know, to kind of just end this to see if you wanted to share with us perhaps share with us a little bit about one of the pieces of the exhibition, maybe something that was particularly compelling to you or exciting to be able to bring to the exhibition. If you want to share with us like one little tidbit, and then we can wrap up.
So it's hard. It's like choosing your favorite kid, but I will try my best. Yeah. The exhibition design was by Sketch Studio. There's a comment in the chat, so I wanted to bring that up. Johan Wolfschen, who's become a thought partner to me. And at the center of the exhibition, there's a video installation by Beatriz Santiago Munoz, Safe House, A-side, B-side. That is a work that we acquired. So it's part of the MCA collection before the show opened, and that really brings together the aesthetic and the sensorial and the social justice part of the show. And it's a video installation that is thinking about what might have happened in these safe houses where the members of the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional were meeting, because there's very little archival material. We did include a couple of communiques, but there's very little memory around the FALN. So for Beatriz, it was really important to think about that sensorial memory of these spaces, like what happened there, what they were talking about. So it's a fictionalized account of the different gestures and movements and perhaps conversations that might have happened in these safe houses. And it really brings together those two histories, like those two like horizon lines between the artistic, the sensorial, and the political.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love hearing from, you know, we have all the different perspectives of us coming to see the show, right? But you as someone who's helped to envision it and then helped to install it. I just want to say that you know, on the opening day of the exhibition, I remember seeing you come out of the gallery and you're like, we just finished, right? As people are like coming in, and you can see how much of that is in there. So it's really beautiful to hear from your perspective, something so beautiful and intimate and succinct about some of these pieces. I hope that little tidbit from Carla really encourages folks to go see the show, to go to Chicago, to experience the Entre Horizontes at the MCA, but also to go to Paseo Boricua to look at our, at our relatives, right, in that space, and to really partake in the kind of beautiful community building and forms of solidarity that have been enacted for so many decades in Chicago. Thank you all for being here. Yes, Puerto Rican Avena and art for the people, says Angel Antonio. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here. Carla, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us this beautiful life work of yours. I hope to see many, many more of your beautiful visions and creations, for many, many years to come. You're always welcome at Centro, and I can't wait to go back to the MCA. Okay, nos vemos, gracias.
Nos vemos. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.